Okay, good. Well, it's great to have you all here again. And today I'm looking at the role of parks and green spaces in that 1866 Glasgow City Improvement Act that we met just fleetingly yesterday. As we saw yesterday, the necessity of air for health and space for it to circulate were central to the philosophy of the first chief medical officer of Glasgow, Sir William Tennant Gairdner, who was a professor in the university. He had been appointed in 1862, just to recap for anybody who wasn't there yesterday, to fight the terrible waves of cholera and the other diseases sweeping Glasgow in the 19th century. And that philosophy of the importance of air and space for it to circulate was reinforced by Gairdner's visit in 1866 with the Lord Provost and other city councillors to Paris to see the recent transformations, as they were called there, by Napoleon and his prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann. And here the slide shows a couple of the sites that greeted the party from Glasgow, the wide tree-lined streets, but also the garden squares and the generous flower and tree-filled public parks, such as you see the Parc Monceau here and the Bois de Boulogne. And here in these places, the Parisians, of course, could stroll, sit at leisure, drive in carriages, breathe the healthful air without obstruction. And Gairdner's response to that, and his colleagues, the councillors who went with him to Paris in 1866, their account that they wrote of their visit seems then to have been one of the key catalysts in the formation later in 1866 of what was known as the Glasgow City Improvement Trust, a means to finance and promote the clearance of the terrible slums, especially in the old east part of Glasgow, whose overcrowded closes and wynds were hotbeds of disease. That led in turn to the City Improvement Act of 1866 that gave a legal framework for Glasgow's drive in tandem with slum clearance to create public parks and gardens, what they called breathing spaces and lungs. Well, by the end of the 19th century, there would be no less than 1,000 acres of Glasgow parks, which is really quite something in the space of less than 50 years. And I'm going today to explore something of their range and evolution before I focus more closely tomorrow on the two created specifically to benefit the East End, Alexandra and Toll Cross Parks, and also on the emergence of a new concern with what you might call natural effects, trees and spaces of greenery that, as it were, resemble nature at Pollock Park, which was given to the city of Glasgow by Sir John Stirling Maxwell in the very early 20th century, even though it was not until after his death that it became more widely publicly accessible. But he was actually giving entrance to the park already on Saturdays from the late 19th century. Newspaper reports show that people were going then to Pollock Park. Well, first, I think we need to note that city improvement was actually a wider movement in the wake of the 1848 Public Health Act that across Britain empowered city councils to create local boards of health and sanitary inspectors to fight cholera. Cholera was sweeping through Europe, and indeed in 1848 it had reached Paris, and it was really, as we saw yesterday, the prime catalyst for Napoleon's and Haussmann's transformations. In Britain, meanwhile, the need to provide breathing space through parks in cities was being promoted by landscape gardeners such as the Scottish-born John Claudius Loudon. Glasgow had actually been one of the worst examples considered by the 1840 Select Committee on Health that informed the 1848 Public Health Act. They noted Glasgow is in a worse condition than any town upon the continent, which is really quite something to have attached to the city, that comment. Anyway, the city improvement work in Glasgow gave initial priority alongside clearing slums like we're looking at here on the screen to clean water supply. And the great Loch Katrine waterworks opened by Queen Victoria in 1859 with the outcome of that. But Lord Provost Robert Stewart, who was the prime mover in the Loch Katrine project, was also instrumental in driving forward the purchase by the city of the land that became Kelvin Grove Park in the west. In the west of the city, the air was cleaner because it was out of the smoke, and the purchase was admittedly something of a patchwork in financial terms. Here's a painting a little bit later by one of the Glasgow boys, 1901, George Henry, of the Kelvin Grove Park. Essentially what happened in the 1850s was that the city stepped in to keep two former private estates, Kelvin Grove and Woodlands, from building development. And the net result was that between 1852 and 1854, the city acquired 66 acres for public use for the really quite significant sum at that point of 77,900 odds, so nearly 78,000. And that area then became Kelvin Grove Park. George Henry here is painting a picture that interestingly was originally larger. Some recent research by Roselle House Galleries in South Ayrshire that owns the picture has revealed that originally there was a dog, for example, in the bottom, and the lower part of it has been cropped for some reason in its lifetime. Anyway, dating already then from before the Paris visit of the Glasgow City Councillors and their Chief Medical Officer Gairdner, the Kelvin Grove Park was essentially Glasgow's answer to Birkenhead Park in Liverpool, which was the very first publicly funded civic park in the world. That had been opened in 1847 and designed by Joseph Paxton, who had worked for the Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth and went on to design, of course, the great iron and glass Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in London of 1851. So you can see a few shots of the sort of layout of the park, its grand entranceway, and then one of the sort of English garden style lakes and more fluid naturalistic sort of planting that were incorporated along with more formal areas in Paxton's design. Well, Glasgow looked at this and engaged Paxton straight off. They got him to design Kelvin Grove Park, and that was then the first purpose-made public park in Scotland. The success and the popularity of Kelvin Grove led to the city acquiring land in turn for what became the Southside Park, Queen's Park, named not actually after Queen Victoria, but after Mary, Queen of Scots, who had fought at nearby Langside. And here we have a period photograph, an early photograph on the left of the park, taken at the spot that was the site, it was believed, of a Caledonian or Pictish camp. So you can see it's a very loaded kind of territory. It's got these associations with the battle by Mary Queen of Scots at Langside. It's got before that this Caledonian or Pictish dimension. And if you look at the aerial view on the right, you can see that it's on an elevation, it's up, raised up, and there is this wonderful prospect then from the top of it, from that Pictish point, right across the city. So there's a kind of national as well as local significance there. Anyway, that park, begun in 1857, was opened in 1862 and went on being transformed and remodeled in various ways as the city absorbed the lessons of the councillor's visit to Paris. But there was still no breathing space or lung for the east of Glasgow. We've got the west served, we've got the south served, but when the city passed when the City of Glasgow Improvement Act was passed in 1866, however, such a park became a legal requirement. The city had to provide air for the rapidly expanding workforce in the factories and industrial areas, industrial works in areas like the East. So it was really quite a bold move that reflects how progressive the City Improvement Trust was, that it had pushed for that act to be passed down in London in order to benefit those most in need of free air, as Gairdner called it. The very same year as the act was passed, and using its new legal provisions, the city purchased in 1866 a large piece of barren, treeless agricultural land in the east from a Mr. Stewart of Hag Hill. And that became what you see on screen, the major part of the new Alexandra Park. This was also designed by Paxton. A smaller piece of land was given then to complete it by a Mr. Dennistoun to create the entrance area so that the park's fine pillared entranceway would harmonise with fine new tenements and houses that Mr. Dennistoun was creating in what then became named after him, the area we know today called Dennistoun. Further sections of the park's edges became available in due course for fewing, a sort of speculative building procedure. That in turn helped repay the city's costs in making the park. That was the funding model that had been used at Kelvin Grove, and it was very similar to what was in use in Paris for some of the parks there. The buildings around the Parc Monceau, for example, which incidentally included the chocolate manufacturer Meunier's residence, were really originally bits of private land that were kind of made available for building after the city acquired what had been a private park, the Parc Monceau. So lots of quite complicated finances involved, but the net result is this light air space. I'm going to look in detail at Alexandra Park and also Toll Cross Park in the east, and made a little bit later in 1897. I'm going to look in detail at them tomorrow, but as we look more widely at the Glasgow parks today, I think it's helpful to pick up on the sense of engagement and commitment, of indeed quite powerful emotional involvement that we met when looking yesterday at Gairdner's and the councillors' account of 1866 of their visit to Paris and their encounter with parks like the Parc Monceau. Gardens, after all, are forms of border or in-between space. Private garden occupies the space between the intimacy of home and the public street. A public garden or park often sits between a conurbation and the wider landscape, or else between two different kinds of space within a town. Elbe Park, for example, apologies, this is a slightly blurry slide, but it's an old one from the City of Glasgow collections. Elbe Park, for example, as you can see here, is right next to the industries around the Forth and Clyde Canal. And Alexandra Park, it shows this perhaps even more distinctively because we have the railway line running down the left side of it. Today we've got the motorway and further roads around it. And of course, in that period photo background, you've got these great smoking chimneys very visible. Well, the period openings of the park, the Alexandra Park, dwell lovingly on the views from it to the countryside, even to Ben Lomond from its highest point. So it was a real space, therefore, of transition, of threshold, in-betweenness, and also of emotion. Because, as we know today, border, boundary, edge, or transition spaces where we experience a shift of gear, as it were, moving from one zone to another, are ones that neuroscientists and psychologists recognize as areas that evoke heightened emotional response. We're on our guard, perhaps, wondering what we'll encounter next as we move from one type of area to another. Or we may be excited, made happy by stepping into a space that's more pleasing to the senses than what we've been in, or that offers pleasurable anticipation by providing views. It's even been found that we have special border cells in the brain that are activated specifically in such transitional spaces. So entering the green space of the Parc Monceau after the asphalt of the surrounding streets, or seeing the beds of flowers in the new Butte-Chaumont Park taking shape upon the bald hills of the Belleville district of eastern Paris, as Gairdner and his colleagues did in 1866, would have been an evocative experience in itself, one that registered emotionally. So it's not surprising that, as we saw yesterday, Gairdner and his colleagues departed from protocol in their report and offered what they called witness impressions instead of a formal dry as dust account. Nor perhaps is it surprising that even before the City Improvement Act, the parks that did exist in Glasgow were keenly prized. There was, after all, Glasgow Green near the cathedral, which is the space thought to have prompted the Dear Green Place nickname for the city in pre-industrial times. That was proudly defended as a piece of common land, even before all the 19th century developments. And when Glasgow's Superintendent of Works in 1817, a Dr. Cleland, began a programme of activities there to secure the area from flooding, he recorded that over 300 unemployed weavers carried out that work with so much commitment and great rapidity, as he wrote, that he was thoroughly impressed and very surprised in a sense. And then a few years later, in 1826, there was a public subscription got up to dig a sewer, lay a carriageway and plant an avenue of trees on Glasgow Green. And that was, again, hugely successful. It was obviously a place that people really identified with, had strong emotional attachment to. And indeed, by the late 1850s, just the era really of these efforts to get public parks put into legal being, Glasgow Green was made a full public park under council management, and then further improvements were carried out through the rest of the century under the powers of the City Improvement Act. 19th century Glaswegians would not, of course, have been aware that border cells were busily firing in their heads as they strolled in their new or revamped parks, or like the children you see here, played happily in the play area that was established in the late 19th century in Glasgow Green. But I do think these discoveries from 21st century science help us to see a little more clearly just why the parks arouse strong feelings, and indeed why we feel so attached to them today. Indeed, there was real rivalry in the 19th century between Queen's Park in the south and Kelvin Grove in the north, for example, and between Alexandra and Toll Cross in the east and Kelvin Grove and the Botanic Gardens in the west. The Botanic Gardens, incidentally, was owned through much of the 19th century by the Botanical Institution, and it was only in 1891 that it was acquired by the city and became a public park, even though people had been allowed in by the Botanical Institution to enjoy it under certain hours and times of day and so on. Well, by the 1860s and 70s then, with the City Improvement Act and its consequences underway and changes occurring left, right and centre, it was arguably art and horticulture, even more than health, that began to provide the essential reference point in these various park rivalries and emotions that people were having towards their local area of greenery. And even today, I think the associations, the memories, the sense of commitment to parks that I've been talking about are really very strong indeed. You just have to think of the friends, for example, of various Glasgow parks. Probably some of you are indeed listening, who pick up litter in a particular park and guard its space very jealously and I think brilliantly, full of admiration for what they do. Parks are not just functional spaces then for taking the air, but ones that, through the way they're designed, in the plants and trees they grow, and the monuments, the sports facilities they house, act as potent foci for civic or community pride, personal attachment, sensory delight, or shared celebration. Just need to look at the crowd gathered to watch the boats that are sailing in Queen's Park in the picture on the right to see that. Well, the great horticultural movement that I mentioned yesterday, this huge importation and transfer of plants from further away to Europe, that increased hugely the range and kinds of plants and trees available to gardeners through expansion, collecting, trade. A whole variety of things came together in the 19th century to make this great horticultural movement, not least the advent of glass houses and invention or the discovery of hybridization. And in all that ferment of horticultural development and activity, Glasgow was really quite central. Sir William Jackson Hooker, for example, who became the Higion at Kew, was a professor at Glasgow, professor of botany, and the Botanic Gardens at that point were his collecting centre, if you like. And more widely in Scotland, new opportunities for travel and trade had enabled plant collectors like David Douglas, who discovered the Douglas fir from North America, to bring back exotic new species really from quite early in the 19th century. The invention of plate glass is what enabled glass houses like Paxton's at Chatsworth or the Kibble Palace, which you see here in the Botanic Gardens in Glasgow, to be created. These allowed tender plants to be overwintered and exotics to flourish, no more dramatically perhaps than in the case of the Victoria Regia water lily at Chatsworth, named after Queen Victoria. This is the great water lily that was grown in the greenhouse that Chatsworth had, created by Paxton. And you can see here, even a child was able to stand on it, quite remarkable. The development of hybridization, crossing one species with another to create a further new, as it were, type of plant, that still further increased the range of plants, crossing of one variety with another, perhaps more than one species with another. And that produced things like hybrid tea roses, also all kinds of gladioli, and we find the two tea roses and gladioli artfully interspersed as a highlight of the Elbe Park at Govan by the 1890s, the Elbe Park being created for the ship construction community at White Inch. Well, horticulture and art then becoming ever more closely entwined in the 19th century, because this process of changing, developing new kinds of plant, bringing exotics in, led to all sorts of almost sort of artificial looking flowers in some people's opinion. They couldn't really believe they were real when they saw the products of some of the hybridizers' efforts. And we find indeed the decorative coming very much to the fore in the so-called carpet beds of annual flowers that were grown each year in the terraces and parterre in parks such as Kelvin Grove, Queen's Park, Alexandra, Springburn Park, you can see here. And also, of course, in the statues, the monuments, the fountains, and the tree-lined avenues and walks that were styled very much Paris style, very much in the style of Haussmann's work for Napoleon III. Gardens are traditionally viewed as nature-made art through human intervention, but with the so-called great horticultural movement of the 19th century, this process arguably reaches a climax of scientific, technical, and aesthetic ingenuity. Indeed, already in 1853, right from the start of the Glasgow Park movement, a superintendent, a kind of dedicated individual, Duncan McClellan, was appointed to look after the planting and the care of the new parks. And he held that post right through the city's park building heyday to 1893. Overseeing a concentrated campaign to choose, plant and maintain suitable flowers and trees right across all the city parks, and thereby, of course, enhancing their sensory and their emotional appeal. Scent, after all, as in the perfume of flowers, triggers memory and the coming together of the senses in the park environment. Scent, along with sight, touch, hearing, after all, music, bandstands and so on, adds a further layer of stimulus to a park's already emotive nature as a border space. And here I'm including just a little glimpse of Kew Gardens. Camille Pissarro, the French Impressionist, visited London in the 1890s and captured this very evocative scene at the top right of the beds and flowers and the great pathway leading along then to Kew's great glass houses. And then on the left, we have a picture of Tolls Cross Park today, where the National Rose Trials take place. So this tradition of scent and colour and the textures of the garden coming together with, in the 19th century, music and these specially constructed bandstands like you see in the photo Springburn Park. We've got this heightening of art and health of parks via the great horticultural movement. We've got all these places being created. Paxton, who advised on Kelvin Grove, Queen's Park, finally Alexandra Park as well, was very ambitious. The council decided it was too expensive to have a grand winter garden, a big greenhouse, a cousin of the Chatsworth and Crystal Palace ones in London. But ultimately, the council did decide that it was a good idea to have that, and eventually they built one in Queen's Park, for example, and in Alexandra. Also in Kelvin Grove Park, meanwhile, we have things like the magnificent Stuart Fountain. So that should be the next slide. Can you move on to that? Yes, good. That celebrated Provost James Stuart, who'd led the creation of the Loch Katrine water supply. It was installed in 1872, still stands today, and it has sculptural ornament by someone called Mossman that illustrates Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake, the famous poem set in the Trossachs, where Loch Katrine is located. Well, this fountain, with its historic Scottish Gothic crown shape, similar to St Giles's in Edinburgh, is also decorated with highly detailed and realistic evocations of plants and flowers. Art and science are, as it were, united in its very body, and cups indeed originally hung from the fountain so that the citizens might benefit from the water supply that Stuart had created, as they stood there breathing the healthful West Glasgow air that his efforts had also safeguarded for their use. There's a strongly physical aspect, in other words, to the art, health and horticulture that come together here. And it's one ultimately that will be carried through to even more dramatic effect, perhaps, in Alexandra Park, for example, when its former quarry is turned into a swimming pool in 1870. That attracted over 59,000 people in its first summer, which is really quite a number. At Kelvin Grove, meanwhile, next slide, please. We have art, science and civic pride coming together in 1888 for the Universal Exhibition that was held there, and again in 1901, and the park then became the frame, the context for these great international exhibitions that were a Scottish counterpart to the ones in London, Paris, Vienna, other cities across Europe and the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And with those developments, that emotive element of the park as a border space was surely at its climax, with the grand horticultural displays matched by the exhibits within intended to display Glasgow's role in the modern world and its status as a city of art. Well, I'm not going to go into detail on those international exhibitions. They're a huge topic in their own right, but we can note, I think, that today art is, of course, permanently linked with horticulture in a very tangible way, because Kelvin Grove Museum and Art Gallery, next slide, still stands, created following the 1901 International Exhibition, and seated at the heart of the park, cheeked by jowl with the tumbling semi-wild River Kelvin, so more water. Is everything going smoothly, Samantha? Still fine, great. So we truly have art, health and horticulture kind of combining here, tugging at the heartstrings of civic pride, pushing those border cells of the brain into overdrive with displays of art, history and natural history, including paintings of proud Scottish landscapes and notable citizens within the museum, and then this quite naturalistic effect, interestingly, in the park roundabout, with an actual river, the River Kelvin, incorporated into the design of the green space. In fact, meanwhile, Duncan McClellan, the park's superintendent, was keenly regretting the way the council had been a bit stingy over Paxton's plans for glass houses as integral parts of Kelvin Grove, Queen's and Alexandra's parks. You might think of them as sort of museums for plants, if you like, also spaces to which the Glaswegians could retreat when it got a bit inclement outside. Glasgow's air, after all, is very often full of rain and not particularly warm. So slide, please, next one. We have on the screen now, hopefully, John Kibble's magnificent Kibble Crystal Art Palace that had originally been part of his private estate at Coulport, and that he gave to the Botanic Gardens in 1873. And at that point, it was then enlarged with the big 150-foot dome, and it became one of the city's most loved attractions, with carefully selected sculptures inside that we can still see today, arranged to complement rare ferns and floral displays, and music, art, health, horticulture, literally in concert, because music was performed there regularly. 2 years later, in 1874, the city architect John Carrick, who was one of the party who'd been with Gairdner to Paris in 1866, came up with a plan to put what he called an immense weatherproof veranda over Glasgow Cross. And had that come about, that plan was clearly inspired by the arcades of Paris and other European cities, and really prophetic of today's great shopping malls. Had it come about, that would certainly have been seen, like Kibble Palace, as a prompt to the decision then in 1895 to construct glass houses for Queen's Park. Next slide, we have the Winter Garden that was also built at this time and became known as the People's Palace, the museum in Glasgow Green in the east. So there's that old rivalry of East and West coming to the fore. The Botanics have their new greenhouse, South Side has its, now here's the East coming in with its People's Palace. So art, horticulture in very direct relationship there again. Indeed, with such covered indoor gardens, the arguments about free air for health had in a sense come full circle. Here now were indoor venues for public benefit, whether in terms of concerts, whether in terms of horticultural displays, and the oxygen emitted by the great leafy palms and orchids, next slide please, and the other exotic plants that provided the decoration within would have, of course, given the people visiting that healthful air that was so important as an antidote to the industry roundabout. At Springburn, which you should be seeing on the screen at the moment, you can see some of those palms, and the Springburn railway workers were the immediate community that this glass house served. Meanwhile, as we'll see tomorrow, there's a splendid winter garden also installed in Toll Cross Park. Campaign in our own time to restore places like Toll Cross, there should be a slide of that, I think, is powerful evidence again of that emotional pull of the park space as a place of transitions, borders, juxtapositions. Well, we might also take note of the bandstand that was so enthusiastically received in the Glasgow parks. Next slide, there should be, I think, a bandstand coming up. Is that moving on all right? Yes. Music then heightening the sensory appeal, arousing the emotions. In the late 19th century, though, we also find the art of the garden turning back again to nature. We've already seen that just to a little extent in Kelvin Grove with the way the river flows through and is incorporated into the design. But we will see in Toll Cross Park tomorrow that there's a glen, a kind of reconstructed bit of nature, as it were. There are ponds also for waterfowl made to teach children about nature there, and in Victoria Park too. And in 1887, the fossil grove, after all, is discovered. Next slide, please. That's the fossil grove in Victoria Park that gave a very vivid reminder of the prehistory of nature, and a rockery was built to accompany the special building around the ancient grove that was now constructed. It's a kind of a revolt beginning almost, or at least a reaction to perhaps the brilliant formal colour displays that Haussmann and the Parisians had become so famous for. And the park superintendent in Glasgow, James Whitton, who succeeded McClellan, published a very interesting account in 1919 where he looked back over the development of the Glasgow public parks since 1852. And he even argues against those kind of formal colour displays that Haussmann had so promoted. He says, Great masses of colour, though desirable in many respects for bold effects, may appeal to the passer-by, but do not create the enthusiasm of, say, a border of roses, sweet peas, carnations, pansies, and similar homely flowers, whilst a border of old-fashioned herbaceous plants, or even a moderate collection of dwarf and alpine plants, will have hundreds of regular visitors who keenly watch the development of their favourites during the season. So there should be a slide next of the herbaceous border in Kelvin Grove. This is the kind of thing he's talking about, a whole group of plants that are allowed to grow in little colonies and clusters, very much as they would in nature, even though part of a broad herbaceous border. There's that sense of harmonious interdependent groups, one colour setting off another, and different sizes and forms of plant interweaving. There's also in Whitten's comment that sweet peas, carnations, and pansies attract enthusiasm from the public, a rather vivid reminder that even before all the park development we've been looking at, the handloom workers of Glasgow in the infancy of the Industrial Revolution had the nickname of bloom worshippers, as an 1860 account put it. If you could bring up the next slide, Samantha, here is one of these, perhaps. It's a little later than the 1860s. He's a 1925 bloom worshipper, but he's growing his own little patch of garden in whatever space he can find. And in his case, it's up on his roof in Port Dundas area, which is a heavily industrial part, not far from the Pinxton Power Station and the St. Rollock's Chemical Works. In other words, that personal enthusiasm for growing. And the Scots were similarly tremendous rose growers through the 19th, 20th centuries. So in a way, the park becomes a kind of thing with which people identify because they are able to grow for themselves. And indeed, the parks give away some of their flowers at the end of the season to people like Mr. Tatton with his own little garden. And as I say, there's something rather less strict, less showy, more intimate and evocative and natural going on in the Glasgow parks by the end of the 19th century. So if you could bring up the next slide, we're moving away from that showy artifice at the Butte Chaumont Park in Paris that had been seen as a model originally for what should be done in the Glasgow parks. Indeed, the maker of the Butte Chaumont, Edouard André, had been rather struck how, when left to its own devices, neglected during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 in France, nature had created effects in the Butte Chaumont that he found superior than those he devised originally, all those decorative flower beds and artificial rocks and so on that you see in the slide here. I'll follow through then tomorrow this tendency to the domestic, the natural, even the wild. But I'd like to add for the moment that it brings a new dimension to the entwining of art, health and horticulture in the Glasgow parks. For there's also what we would nowadays call an emerging awareness of mental health by the end of the 19th century. Whitten, recalling his work as superintendent of the Glasgow parks at that time, comments that broad, well-kept lawns with fine trees and shrubs give that feeling of repose and refinement which to thousands is the most health-giving power city parks possess. And in that, he was probably influenced by what he'd seen in a visit he made in 1897 to Hamburg, Berlin, and various cities in Germany, Holland, and Belgium. So the next slide shows the Elbe Park, the English-style garden based on late 18th century principles of nature as art that had been created in Hamburg. So it's interesting, he feels that this provides a quiet, calm retreat from the heat and noise of the streets, a dreamy, poetic calm. Ultimately, though, Whitten, writing in 1897 about what he sees in Hamburg and other places in Germany, concludes that because the Glasgow climate is a bit different from that in Germany, we need open areas in Glasgow upon which the sun and wind can act, as he puts it, so that there are airing places for the infirm and aged, as well as playgrounds for the young and active. And that gospel of air, Gairdner's gospel of air and breathing spaces that the City Improvement Act had secured, was still clearly the guiding compass in Glasgow. Well, we'll look tomorrow then at the struggles the makers of Alexandra Park faced to snatch free air from smoke and soot, and the triumphs they achieved. And we'll also pursue the idea of nature itself as art. But I think something distinctive is coming to fore in that interest in the psychic or mental health that a park can foster, that we find in Whitton's comments. And that's just slightly different, I think, from some of the things that are going on the continent. And I will argue tomorrow it's a freer, a more varied kind of synthesis of art, health and horticulture that emerges in Glasgow. And we'll consider that, as I say, a little more and quite emerged tomorrow. So thank you very much.